Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amel Mestari, Procurement Director for Bouygues Energies and Services Solutions, and I would like to welcome you to our to Bouygues Construction in the UK webinar on climate change. So first of all, some housekeeping. You can see and hear us. We cannot see or hear you. Please ask your questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen, and the event moderator will collect and assign questions according to topics. We will try and answer as many questions as time allows, and we will do it at the end of the different speakers. If you lose connection for any reason, simply rejoin using the original link. The meeting is being recorded and will be made available after the event. So as you all know, yesterday was the launch of COP26, demonstrating the importance for countries and business to act. So today we wanted to share with you Bouygues' objectives and how we need your support to achieve those. So I'd like to introduce David Carr, our CEO for Bouygues Energies and Services Solutions, to introduce the event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by saying a big thank you. A big thank you for all our partners, for all the support that they've given us over the years. Our partners have really stood up and been counted, especially as we've gone through the pandemic. It's been a real demonstration of resilience, and I've been absolutely amazed at how well we've been supported through what's been a really difficult couple of years. The long-term relationships that we have with our partners is absolutely essential. Many of you we've been working with a long time. Some of you even since the very beginning of this organisation. And the depth and understanding of those relationships is what helps us work collaboratively and work effectively together. We've evolved together and we've grown together. And of course, as we face different challenges, we face them very much together. And with a backdrop to COP26, really is providing a timely reminder of what we all need to be doing to make sure that we tackle the challenges that our planet faces today. What we've got to do as an organisation is move mountains. What we've got to do as the people of the world is make real and meaningful change. And the only way that we're going to do that is by working together. What we are doing today is we're helping our supply chain, our partners, develop and understand what we're looking to achieve. And hopefully go away a little bit wiser and feel a little bit more motivated in terms of what contribution you can make to helping us in our climate challenge. So I'll finish by thanking you once again for all the support you've given us over the years, and that support has been absolutely immense. But when it comes to our planet, just remember, doing it together, we can make a real difference. Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to James Cadman. James.
Super. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share my slide deck with everyone. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Cadman. I work for an organisation called Action Sustainability, and we're the business behind the Supply Chain Sustainability School. And I've been invited along here today with Bouygues to discuss and give you an overview of climate change and carbon. Some of it will be familiar to you already, but I want to start from a place where everybody's included in the knowledge about climate change, what's driving it, what's causing it, and importantly, what we can do about it. So if you know some of this already, treat it as a bit of a revision class. If not, then hopefully there'll be something new for you. We will be sharing the slides afterwards, so if you want to take any notes, by all means do so, or any screenshots, but we'll share them as a PDF later if you want to refer back to them or share them with colleagues. This is the philosophy of the supply chain school, that it's all open source. So climate change itself, going right back to first principles here with some of the science behind it, and the greenhouse gas effect. It's a phrase we don't really hear so much these days, but it is what's driving climate change. The greenhouse gas effect is a perfectly natural phenomenon. Without it, the planet would be too cold for us to survive. We wouldn't have liquid water, but with it, the average temperature of the planet is about 15 degrees Celsius. On average. So obviously it's colder the further north and south you go, warmer in the equator, but on average 15 degrees. And that's because we've got the atmosphere that acts a bit like a greenhouse, or a duvet might be a better analogy, and it traps in some of the sun's heat, and it makes us warm, and it keeps the water as a liquid. But what we're doing with climate change is we're exacerbating that. We're making that duvet thicker, that blanket is thicker, and we're keeping in more of the sun's energy, less of it is escaping, and consequently the atmosphere is heating up, and that is being caused by greenhouse gas emissions, various different gases that we emit through various different processes that are adding to that blanket. So one thread I want to drive home through this is that much of what we're talking about are natural phenomena, but we're exacerbating them, we're making them more extreme and more frequent. This graph, and apologies, I do like lots of pictures and lots of graphs, but they do speak 1,000 words. This one shows the emissions of carbon dioxide going back over the last 250 years or so. And you can see on the bottom, you've got the timeline. At the left-hand side, you've got emissions of carbon dioxide in billions of tons, huge numbers. But you can see how it very steeply goes up from about 1900. And those are the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions, or the emissions each year, that are coming from all those various countries you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, and that's that steep spike that's going up. This is all measured data that we get from various places around the world, and what we're trying to do is make that clear correlation between what we're seeing in the weather and the climate, more importantly, and how that's linked to increases in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So we know what the theory is. We know that the amount of carbon dioxide is increasing exponentially over the last century or so. And what that's doing to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is it's pushing up the concentration. So that duvet is getting thicker effectively. And what this picture shows is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back over 800,000 years. So we're talking geological timescales. And you can see on the left-hand side, you've got the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere that's been measured. They very cleverly dig cores out of the Antarctic ice layer. They do some clever measurements and they work out how much CO2 was in the atmosphere at that point. And you can see it wavered between about 180 parts per million up to maybe about 300 parts per million. That's what ppm stands for. And when it was higher, we had warmer periods, and when it was lower, we had cooler periods, we had ice ages. And it kind of naturally fluctuated for a long time. But you can see on the right-hand side, it's steadily or steeply gone up, and we're now at about 414, 415 parts per million. So the concentration has gone up. We're pumping more into the atmosphere. That was the previous graph. The concentration is going up, and it's getting, there's more of it up there. Important to reflect that 400 parts per million is a very low number, but it has a very significant effect. Clearly, the atmosphere is mainly oxygen and nitrogen, and we kind of need the oxygen to survive, but there's these small trace amounts that do have a big impact. And just to put some context on that, when we appeared on the planet, you can see how long back we've been looking with our measurements. What that means for the temperature is that it's been going up steadily since the Industrial Revolution, and it's now about 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution. So often when we talk about climate science, we refer back to measurements in the climate before the Industrial Revolution really kicked in the mid-19th century. And again, these are measurements, and it's steadily been ticking up over time. And this is important because even though it's only a 1 degree Celsius increase, and in kind of northern latitudes in the winter, that would be a lovely thing to have, slightly warmer winter, it has a great impact on the Earth's ecosystems and weather systems. So again, it's a small amount to us in terms of the changes in the temperature, but the impacts on the weather systems are huge. Similarly, the small amounts of additional CO2 and other greenhouse gases is marginal in some respects, but it has a huge impact. And what we see, and I don't need to tell you this, how many weather reports and news items there are about the impacts we see globally. And if any of you watched some of the presentations at COP26 from yesterday, you'll have seen similar images from David Attenborough. It's extreme drought, it's extreme wildfires, extreme flooding. These are all natural events. These all happen naturally, but we're making them more frequent and more severe. And there's the knock-on effects on people's lives, their livelihoods, the fabric of buildings, and so on. So climate change can be described as a multiplier. It makes these effects bigger and more frequent. And you'll have seen many of these recently, particularly the flooding in Central Europe over summer. Only 2 days ago, there was extreme flooding in the southwest of Scotland just the day before COP started. So it's very, very apparent. I suppose the next question is, well, who's causing this? Who's at fault? Who's to blame? And essentially, we all are. As a planet, but just putting some numbers on this, there's a picture here that describes which countries emit the most, and the deeper the red, the more emissions they make. And unsurprisingly, big populous industrial countries like China, like the US, like Russia, India as well, emit a lot of carbon emissions, and you can see some of those figures on the side. That's not to say that the UK with 1% of global emissions can't do anything. We all have a role to play. We all have a part to play in this, particularly some of those low-lying Pacific Island nations that we saw yesterday. Everyone has a contribution to make in this. Spinning that on a different axis, which sectors of the economy produce most of the emissions? And this is one of many charts that you'll find if you go searching on the internet. Predominantly, 3/4 of all the greenhouse gas emissions come from the consumption of energy. It's basically burning dead dinosaurs. That's a phrase I picked up recently. I think it sums it up well. Oil, gas, coal, producing energy in some shape or form, whether it's in buildings, whether it's in vehicles, or directly in industrial use. There's a lot of energy consumed there. But we shouldn't forget other sources, agriculture predominantly as well, but also some other industrial processes like cement manufacture, for example, that give off a lot of greenhouse gas emissions just as part of that chemical process. So you can see some of the different percentages and breakdown as to where emissions come from. And what this says to me is that there's no one single solution, which is a good thing, that we're not all hankering after the same silver bullet to solve this, that there's lots of solutions we can try, lots of different technologies, different ways of working that will help contribute to us solving this problem, which gives us variety and it gives us innovation as well, and the opportunity for competition and differentiation. So I think that's a positive thing. Some of the detail, I was on a call earlier this morning with the French Chamber of Commerce with Lewis, and we were talking about various different bits of jargon and terminology we all need to know. Sadly, there is some jargon and there are some acronyms that we need to know if we're going to have the language of carbon and climate change. And some of them are about, is to do with the kind of gases that cause climate change. And these are the main gases, and I've put them up here for you to have a quick look at. The main one predominantly is carbon dioxide. If you burn anything, it's the combustion process. You'll get CO2 given off as a greenhouse gas. It's the most prevalent. When I talked earlier about the annual emissions of CO2 being about 35-40 billion tonnes per year, when you add all the other greenhouse gases into that, the total is about 50 billion tonnes. So CO2 is by far the most predominant. But there are other gases as well, like methane, which comes from agriculture, comes from biodegradation of wastes. Nitrous oxide, which if anyone's been in a maternity hospital will know it's called Entonox. It's also laughing gas. It has other properties as well as a propellant gas. And then various others which are used in high voltage switchgear like sulfur hexafluoride and some of those other compounds that are used in heating and ventilation systems, the HFCs and PFCs that you see there. There are many, many gases that have an impact on the world's climate, but these are the main ones. These are the ones that get the focus because they're the most predominant, they're the most frequently used. They're sometimes called the Kyoto Protocol basket of 6 greenhouse gases. They get the focus for us trying to reduce our emissions in line with what we saw coming out of Paris 6 years ago, this 1.5 or 2 degree limit above those pre-industrial revolution temperatures that we saw back then. So there's lots of sources for this. And again, this gives us diversity in terms of the way we can tackle it. So what are we actually doing about it? That was the science. Now we're going to go on to what the governments and sectors are doing actively about climate change. So a bit of the backstory, and it's very opportune given what's happening in Glasgow at the moment. This has been going on for decades, but some of those key landmark reports and meetings that have happened over time include some of the ones you see on the slide now. The Brundtland report from 1987, you know, we're looking at 35 odd years ago here, talked about the future of our children and the needs of today and the needs of tomorrow, and that became the definition of sustainable development. And that then led into a burgeoning realization globally that we need to look after our environment, not just climate change, but biodiversity and all the other things that go in and around that. The Earth Summit in Rio in '92 was really the kickstart for this kind of work, and that led to the formation of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. They're the body that run what's happening now in Glasgow, the Conference of Parties. That moved on to Kyoto, and I mentioned the basket of 6 greenhouse gases in Kyoto, landmark agreement to address what we're doing. Globally, nations coming together in 1997, and then more recently in Paris we had the Paris Climate Change Agreement ratified in 2016, and that set out a 15-year plan on what we're going to do globally together, and each country as well making its own contribution to how we're going to tackle climate change. You might have heard the phrase nationally determined contribution in some of the news reports lately. A lot of this jargon is seeping into the BBC and other news outlets. So our NDC, as the UK, our nationally determined contribution, is that we're going to reduce our emissions territorially in the UK by 68% by the year 2030 compared to what they were back in 1990. And each country that's part of this has pledged their own equivalent NDC. And obviously, bang up to date, we're at COP26 in Glasgow, and that's taking that conversation forward, and there's a lot of expectation that we're at a turning point here. We're at an inflection. Putting a bit more science on that and coming to the concept of net zero, what this picture is showing us, again, there's the timeline along the bottom from 1990 out to the future in 2100, and up the left hand side you're seeing global annual greenhouse gas emissions. Again, they're in billions of tons or gigatons, and you can see the black line that's slowly ticking up, and we're on this trajectory of just ever increasing carbon emissions. As more and more countries get prosperous and develop, more people want to consume more stuff, essentially, carbon emissions go up. But we can't keep doing that. We need to bring that curve down. It's similar to what we were discussing last year with the pandemic. How can we bend that curve? And you can see there's various scenarios. There's the do nothing scenario, there's do current policy scenarios. But even with those, there's still huge temperature rises and the concomitant impacts that will come from that. So even the pledges and targets one, where we make some pledges, will bring the curve down, but maybe not enough, because we're still looking at a 2-degree warming world and the impacts that will come from that slide I showed you with forest fires and hurricanes and so on. So we're looking to really bend that curve down to ideally the 1.5-degree pathway that you see in that kind of greenish colour at the bottom. And that's essentially us reducing and mitigating all our emissions. So we're emitting far, far less greenhouse gas emissions overall across the entire economy. But I've put that red line in there specifically at 2050 because there's a little gap. We haven't brought it down to absolute zero. And that's where the concept of net zero comes in. Because even then, there are still going to be some emissions. Maybe it's aviation, maybe it's agriculture, but there'll still be some greenhouse gas emissions that we just cannot decarbonize, or the technology is not there yet. So we need to remove those in some other shape or form. And that's where the concept of net zero comes in, because we can balance it off. The UK. We have the UK's Climate Change Act that's been around since 2008. We're one of the first countries to develop legally binding targets at a national level on reducing carbon. It's been updated since then. In 2019, it was updated to be 100% to be net zero, not just 80% reduction. And the graph you're looking at now from the Committee for Climate Change shows how we've reduced our territorial emissions since 1990. That thick black line shows that we've reduced them by about 40% since 1990, in about 30 years time, and a lot of that has been from decarbonising the UK's grid, but from other things as well. And then beyond that, you can see the purple dash line as to what we've got to do over the next 30 odd years. And that is where our net zero target comes in. We're reducing our emissions and balancing those that we can't yet decarbonise. Scotland and Wales have got slightly different targets because of devolution, and rightly so. Their economies are slightly different than the UK overall, so they've got slightly different targets. And then more recently, the UK government set an intermediate legally binding target of a 78% reduction by 2035. So halfway along that timescale to 2050. This is what we need to do as a country within that 15-year timescale. So it gives us a milestone along that journey. We're not waiting to the end and hoping to see it all turns out okay. So that's the UK basis. Many other countries have got targets as well. The Republic of Ireland has got one very similarly, and many countries around the world are developing these kinds of pieces of legislation and net zero targeting. More recently, in June this year, central government in the UK put out PPN 0621, Procurement Policy Notes for June 2021. That's all that means. And essentially, it's a piece of not legislation, but guidance and policy that the UK government, when they're going out to procure big contracts, and this is not just construction and built environment, this is any contract, if it's over £5 million, excluding VAT per year, then the contract will have to have a carbon reduction strategy that aligns with the UK's net zero targets. And if I know anything about procurement and supply chain management, that will be cascaded down through the supply chain, and rightly so. So each organisation who's involved in that work should provide some evidence to say, yes, we have a carbon reduction strategy. This is what we're doing about our contribution to reducing emissions. And this is the perfect forum for that, because the value chain all needs to come together to provide those solutions. So that came into force at the end of September, and it will be kicking into action very soon, I would imagine. So what's our sector doing? So we're taking it from the global picture down to governments, and now we're getting closer to the built environment sector. The Construction Leadership Council produced documentation back in March of this year about what our sector should be doing, and they came up with various things across all aspects of construction and built environment that should be done, whether it's zero emission vehicles in transport, retrofitting existing building stock, designing new buildings to be super efficient in terms of their energy consumption, understanding how we measure and how we design out carbon right from the beginning, how we promote innovation for new materials, low carbon materials, and across the piece. But they very much tied it into those numbers I've been talking about. So one good example is about plant and equipment on site, that they're saying that by the year 2035, there should be 78% less diesel emitted from plant and equipment on site. And that ties in directly to that milestone I talked about a minute or two ago. So making it align to the UK's net zero targets. But being holistic, again, there's lots of things in there that different organisations can look at, whether they're predominantly material suppliers or subcontractors or ground workers or fit out specialists. There's something in there for everybody, essentially, and you kind of almost pick and choose what's relevant for you. Net zero is something I touched upon a minute ago, but there are various definitions floating around. It's something that hasn't quite consolidated. For those of a certain age, you'll recognise the VHS Betamax analogy. It hasn't quite overlaid yet. There are two kind of definitions that have come out from the UK Green Building Council on net zero. One on the construction side of things, about up to the point of completion, that there'll be on balance net zero carbon emissions through various mechanisms, lower carbon being emitted, more efficiency through embodied carbon, lower carbon in the materials, and then using offsets and balancing mechanisms where there's that hard to decarbonize carbon that you just cannot get rid of at this stage. And similarly, there's an analogous one for operational energy, about running the facility, running the asset or the building once it's been commissioned, and how you can manage it as efficiently as possible with low carbon equipment, energy efficient equipment, and so on. So there are some definitions out there to work on in terms of net zero and help organisations work towards that process. There's lots of reasons we should be doing this. There's clearly the stuff that we'll have seen from David Attenborough and Boris Johnson and other people, but here's just some other examples as to the drivers. This is about sustainable business. It's about still being in business in 10, 20, 50 years time. It's about meeting compliance and regulation needs. It's about winning work and reputation that goes with it. There's demands from your stakeholders, your customers, but also your own colleagues. There'll be lots of reasons why we should be looking at this. And importantly, carbon isn't there just for itself. It's part of that decision making matrix. So when you look at a project or a package, or you're working with a supplier, it's about quality, it's about price, delivery schedule, after sales service, sustainability as well, carbon as well is clearly part of that decision making process. So it's not all about just saving the planet for us. It's about lots of many other reasons as well. I'm going to talk about a bit of the jargon. As I mentioned earlier, some of this jargon is part of the parlance these days. You can't get away from it. So it's good to have an understanding or an appreciation of it, even if you're never going to become a climate change expert or carbon expert. It's good to understand some of the lingo that goes around. So first of all, where can emissions come from in your organisation and your supply chain? And there's some simple diagrams to show where those emissions can come from. Clearly, your own business, your own organisation, if you have your own buildings, your own depots, your own vehicles, your own plants and equipment, those emissions can arise from the burning of fossil fuels. You can also have fugitive emissions, so small leaks from your HVAC, for example, can lead to small leaks of greenhouse gas emissions can escape. So there's stuff that you can control directly within your own business. But then there's your suppliers, and this is exactly why we're having this call today for Bouygues. There's a lot of stuff and emissions from your supply chain. Essentially, if you buy something, if you pay someone for a service or a product, you are inadvertently causing those carbon emissions. So therefore you have a responsibility for them. By paying someone for a train ticket for your business travel, or you're buying some concrete off a supplier, you are causing those emissions to be created. So there's lots of different categories in your supply chain where you have an influence working with your contractors and your suppliers over the emissions that are created. But similarly, there's your customers as well. You know, you are a customer to your suppliers, and likewise you have customers. Pretty much everyone has a supplier and a customer somewhere. So it's the same kind of mindset. You have an obligation as a supplier to your customer to reduce your emissions as far as possible, to help them with their net zero journey. So you can see that there's this interlink along the value chain, and we all have a role to play. Some of the key jargon in there, and I'm sure you've heard these words before. Embodied carbon, sometimes called capital carbon in the infrastructure world, is about the emissions that are associated with the products and services that you buy in. And it's the materials, the transport, the logistics, and so on, the waste utilities that you might procure as well. That's the embodied carbon within those services and those products. You'll also have operational carbon, which hopefully is self-explanatory, what you're consuming directly yourself, but you can also have the downstream bit as well with your end user carbon, when you've commissioned and handed over a product or an asset or a building, that the end user has got some carbon consumption. The example I often give is of a product that we all have at home, like a TV or a washing machine. Someone in the middle, the business, has manufactured that energy using product. They've worked with their suppliers to get components and parts. They manufacture it, and then the end user is us in our homes using that washing machine and consuming energy during its lifetime, the 10-15 years that washing machine might survive for. So we all have that part to play. Importantly, what can we do about it? The key buzzwords here are mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is simply emitting less. It's reducing our impact directly now. Adaptation is being honest and saying, look, there are changes to the climate already. We need to adapt to them. And that comes in both forms. So when we're designing and commissioning a new building or an asset, we want to mitigate the emissions from that building in its design, construction, operation, and so on, but also adapt to the environment that's around us. And you can see there's a few examples on screen about what that might look like. And some nice pictures as well of some nice shiny electric vehicles. So you can see that there's lots of different ways again that I want to get across, that there's no one silver bullet, and it depends on the situation where you're at in your particular geography, your part of the value chain, the kind of business that you work in, and the different services that you provide. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but take away from this that there are mitigation and adaptation issues, and many client organizations are now asking about both of those. Some of the more discrete actions that you can possibly take around the equipment you use, the vehicles you use, being more efficient. So thinking about different kinds of vehicles, different kinds of equipment. Consider the materials you use, and this all links into circular economy as well. If you're using less material, or the material has greater recycled content, or you have better recycling afterwards, you're reducing the embodied carbon impact. You're just consuming less stuff, basically, which inherently means less embodied carbon. And it also leans into other issues like off-site manufacture, being more effective with your waste and reducing the cost of waste, and lean construction as well. All these things tie in together. They're not isolated. And importantly, I want to get across the human aspect, the behaviours piece. It's the other side of the same coin. We can buy lots of fancy, efficient equipment and sensors and automatic switches and this, that, and the other. But if people aren't trained on how to use them and they don't use them effectively, the possibility, the opportunity is missed, or it's not maximised. So we need to think about how we bring people along with this journey as well. So it's competence, it's training, it's skills, it's that whole agenda as well as the equipment and the materials that go with it. All of this leads into something called the carbon hierarchy, which is analogous to the waste hierarchy. So if you remember, reduce, recycle, hopefully we all do that at home with all our packaging. There's a similar one for carbon and energy, unsurprisingly. And it follows the same kind of mantra. If you can avoid using energy and use some kind of passive approach, then great. Don't use the energy in the first place. And there are some examples out there, but quite often that's quite hard to do. You do need to consume some energy. So if you do, use less, be smarter, think about more efficient equipment, some of those things we just saw. When you've done that, think about switching to lower carbon forms of energy. That might be using solar panels on your lighting rig rather than a diesel generator, for example. It might be hooking up to a grid connection rather than using a diesel generator. Lots of different opportunities there about how you can reduce your carbon impact. And then only when you've done all of those things and you've gone through everything and said, well, how can we reduce or eliminate carbon emissions and energy consumption, all of these different options, only then can you think about, well, we've got some left over that's hard to decarbonize at present, then we can think about removals or offsets or compensation. And all of this is part of the basic approach to a carbon reduction strategy. What we're trying to do here with the carbon reduction strategy is say, well, what are the key hotspots we want to address? What are you actually going to do? We've set a big target. Great. How are we actually going to do it? So we need to set our scope and boundaries. We're going to understand which part of our business is included, what's the baseline year, and how we're going to measure it. Because if you haven't got a baseline, you can't demonstrate your progress. You can't show your improvement. So you need to set that base year and your targets and really delineate what is in your business that you're measuring. Go out and measure it, and we'll come on to that in a minute. Actually measure some carbon, understand where the impacts are, identify those hotspots. Where's your biggest bang for your buck, where you're going to get the biggest reductions for the smallest amount of money and investment. Go off and do it. Do those reductions, put those measures in place, invest in the equipment and the materials and the training and the competence, and measure it as well. Measure the improvement that you've gained from that against the baseline that you set before. And as I was saying earlier, only when you've done all that, think about any offsets or carbon removals, more importantly, actually extracting carbon from the atmosphere. And then finally, tell someone about it, report it. Some of it will be mandatory reporting through the company report, the director's report obligation and streamlined energy and carbon reporting, but tell other people, tell your clients, tell your stakeholders. Demonstrate that you're actually taking action and reducing your carbon emissions. So the measurement piece, I'm going to go very quickly through the measurement piece just to give you an idea about how you might manage your carbon emissions using carbon footprinting. So this is like any kind of environmental piece here. You want to set your goal. Why are we doing this? What's the point of doing this? It might be for a tender. It might be because you're looking for some innovation seed funding. It might be because you're looking for opportunities to reduce your overhead costs. Lots of different reasons, but set the goal so you know how much time and effort and resource to put into it. Who are the stakeholders? Who's the audience for this? And once you've done that, set the scope and boundaries, like I was saying earlier. What are you including? Which parts of your business are you including? And which are you not including, more importantly? Then it's going out, gathering the data, doing the analysis, and then reporting back on that. So this is a bit of jargon 101. And if there's one phrase or one bit of jargon I want you to take away from this, if you don't know it already, is what scope 1, 2, and 3 mean when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. This is taken from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the kind of the main approach to understanding and reporting on carbon emissions. But what this is basically telling us, and it's similar, if you've noticed, to the diagram I showed earlier with the 3 big green arrows on the slide. There's something called direct emissions, and those are your emissions from your organization, where basically you're putting the match to the fuel in effect, whether it's the gas in the boiler or the diesel in the truck. So you're emitting directly those greenhouse gas emissions. They're called your scope 1 emissions, and you should have good control over where they come from and how much you're actually emitting, because it's your business. All the other emissions are indirect emissions. It's where you've paid somebody for something. And they're split out into 2 different sections. There's scope 2, which is essentially your electricity. So when you buy power off Npower, E.ON, British Gas, whoever it might be, there are others available. That's your scope 2 electricity. Scope 3, indirect, is your supply chain effectively. There's a downstream bit as well, but we'll focus on supply chain for the moment. The scope 3 indirect is all your supply chain, and you can see those on the screen. It's the materials you buy, the business travel that you buy, the water and the waste utilities that you buy as a service. It's if you have leased assets and transport and distribution through third parties. All of those are captured in what's known as scope 3. If you're interested in learning more about this, the Supply Chain School is doing a lunch and learn session tomorrow when we dig into this a lot more deeply. Tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. But that's essentially where your emissions lie. So having an understanding of this is really important to be able to understand your footprint. This kind of gives a picture to where those emissions and how they interact with each other. So the question that's often accused is, well, surely there's double counting. The reason we have scopes 1, 2, and 3 is to make sure that people understand that there is no double counting. So me as a supplier, it might be my scope 1 emission, but for my client, for Bouygues, it's part of their scope 3. So it's the same actual emissions, but we account for them differently. It is accounting, so we make sure that there's no overlap in that system. And then how we might put our boundaries together, just building on this picture from earlier, we should definitely include our scope 1 emissions, the things that we are accountable for directly, those in the middle. Our electricity as well, because we get billing, we get invoicing, so we should be able to understand what that is. And with smart meters these days, there's a lot more detail on that. Business travel should be fairly easy as well. If you have an agent or an HR team that does business travel for you, gathering that data should be relatively easy to do as well. And many of those now provide the carbon data as well as the mileage data. And then look at your suppliers. It's often been in the hard to do bucket, but it's getting easier. There are more and more systems to help us do that. And where does that data come from? The one thing I want to stress here is that there's lots of data. It's not so much about the numbers, but about the relationships you have with the people who own that data. So it's about understanding who has it and how you can get access to that data. So there's lots of varieties of data, and it comes in different formats known as activity data. And you see whether it's liters or tons or kilowatt hours. That's the activity data you need. And the data will be held by various different departments that you can see here. And it's getting access to them and finding that information. And then one thing I want to do is break down some of the smoke and mirrors about carbon footprinting. It can be hugely complex because organizations are complex, projects are complex, but at the heart of it, it's very, very simple. A carbon footprint is simply taking some activity data, something that you do, something that you use, and you multiply it by an emission factor and you get a carbon emission. It's a simple multiplication, that's all it is. So here's an example. If you're burning some diesel, you have 250 litres of diesel, that's your activity data. You grab that from a specification or from a procurement note. You get the emission factor there that's in the blue, and that comes from a database that's freely available. You don't have to remember these numbers, and you do the multiplication and you get your answer. That is your carbon footprint of that generator, for example, running for a set number of hours. One little bit I want to point out here is a little E that you see at the end of CO2. That means equivalent. So all those greenhouse gases I talked about earlier, like methane, nitrous oxide, and so on, there's a bit of a conversion going on. So they are all comparable. It's apples and pears. So it's like converting your dollars to pounds and euros to pounds so that they're all comparable. So if you see CO2 equivalent, it's bringing in all the other greenhouse gases as well. Some of those emission factors, there's lots of them out there. As I say, you don't have to remember them. Sadly, I do because I do this for a job, but there's lots of different emission factors out there that you can refer to. And having an awareness of this that can help you in that decision-making process, in that design process or that procurement process. What should we be looking for when we're trying to reduce our carbon emissions in terms of travel and energy provision in this case? You can see that the numbers are slightly different for exactly the same outcome, whether it's a kilowatt hour of power or 500 kilometers traveled, the impacts are different. So having an awareness of this is really useful. And similarly with materials, the embodied carbon of different materials. So there's a ton of each of those materials you can see on the screen. They all have wildly different embodied carbon impacts. Clearly they're different materials, they have different purposes, but if you're looking at a design and you're thinking, well, how can we reduce our carbon? Looking at the amount of concrete to steel ratio, for example. And then as you see in the bottom right hand corner, there's various other differences that can come into play as well. The numbers that I've put on screen are kind of averages, global averages, but it depends on how they're manufactured, where they're manufactured, how they're shipped, what the ingredients are in the mix that go into making, for example, plasterboard or concrete. So having an awareness that not all materials are equal is really important in this process. And then you can get other sources of information. One of the main ones in our sector is environmental product declarations, EPDs. Some of you may have your own already in your organizations. These are a shortcut for your client, at least, to say and understand what the environmental impacts are of that material, of that product. And someone does a very clever study and they come up with a short report that's 10 or 12 pages long and says, in the manufacture of this product, it consumes so much energy and therefore the carbon footprint is X. And that's really helpful in helping you understand the different impacts and being able to compare different products. And there's two examples here. There's a kind of a wooden board used in the housing sector, and there's a pump, a screw pump that's used in the water sector. Wildly different products, but the process is exactly the same. Really useful information. I'm going to do a very quick case study, and then I think I'm done with my section, just to show you the demonstration of how we can actually use carbon footprinting to support a business decision or a design decision. So this is a real case study, something I was involved in a couple of years ago, about designing different options for tunnels, rail tunnels. And there were several options, but the two main principal options were the one on the left, which was essentially they looked at, do you do a cut and cover where you dig a trench in a hill? You put in a square concrete box and then you cover it over, and that's your tunnel. Or do you tunnel out literally from underneath the mountain, underneath the hill, and then you put in an arch concrete tunnel? Same effect, same outcome, but two different ways of doing it. And working out the carbon footprint of those. So option one is the cut and cover, the trenching, and then putting in the square box and covering it over. Option two is the arch tunnel with some tunnel boring machines going on. And you can see the vast difference in the carbon impact coming out from those. You're looking at over 30,000 tons different, and it's predominantly in the concrete and the steel, those really two big spikes on the right hand side of that graph. The others are important, but less so, less significant. So the focus is on the concrete and the steel. In terms of the process that was undertaken, if you look at the difference and where that comes from, if you're doing a tunnel boring approach rather than a cut and cover, you're moving less muck around the site. You're not picking it up, moving around, dropping it and moving around several times, to the tune of over 2 million meters cubed is what was calculated. And that was equivalent to 73,000 fewer vehicle movements, those big dump trucks that you see. So in that, there's all the carbon emissions, definitely. There's local air quality pollution, there's noise, there's dust, there's disturbance to local neighbourhoods and so on. So there's lots of other benefits as well, not just the carbon piece. So that's one part of it, that's the earthworks. Less concrete was used in the arch option, about 22,000 metre cubed of concrete, which is equivalent to about £2 million when we did this in terms of value. So there's a financial benefit as well as a material and carbon benefit. And similarly with the rebar, the steel that goes into it, a bit, again, big saving just through the design to save on materials and save on cost. These designs weren't done necessarily with carbon in mind. They came up with several designs, and it's, well, let's take them and see what the carbon impacts are of them. So it wasn't a kind of pre-engineered, let's reduce out carbon, but it could certainly be done in that fashion. And then just to put some scope on that, what does 33,000 tons of carbon dioxide look like? Because I have no idea either, but here's some examples of what that is equivalent to, whether it's HGVs on the road or flights to New York and back, or the one I like best is the 10,000 UK homes being powered for a year. So this is significant stuff, this is big stuff. It's not just a drop in the ocean, so it's worth doing along with those cost savings as well. And finally, I'm just going to finish on what the Supply Chain Sustainability School is doing about this. We have a group that Bouygues are involved in called the Climate Action Group. It's one of the many groups that the Supply Chain School does. And through that, we've developed a free carbon calculator. It's a tool that's online. You can use it to put in your carbon numbers, launched a few weeks ago, or the updated version was launched a few weeks ago. And essentially it's there to calculate those carbon emissions I just talked about. You put in your activity data, whether it's your diesel use or your mileage or your consumption of materials. The tool does all the calculation for you. The key bit about it is that you as a supplier or subcontractor can go in and say, well, I do 5% of my revenue with Bouygues, I do 6% with Skanska and 7% with Kia, and the tool will automatically distribute and apportion your emissions accordingly within that. So it's a free to access tool. We can give you details on how to get involved in that. And it's important for partners of the school, so Bouygues, because they get an understanding of what their scope 3 supply chain footprint looks like. And as suppliers, you get the benefit that you input your data once. You're not doing the data several times to several clients in slightly different ways. We're very much trying to make the burden of reporting less for the supply chain. And lastly, I'm not expecting you to read this, but there's in the slide deck that you'll get after this is a slide, this slide that gives you a lot of resources that you can go and look at, databases, calculators and so on that help you with calculating your carbon. That's me done. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. No, not yet.
Should be okay now, Lee.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Lee Hughes. I am Bouygues Construction in the UK's CSR Director. And before I go forward, I just want to give a massive thank you to James and his presentation there. I thought it was really excellent, informative and useful, and we'll expand further that with fellow speakers to explain how that links in with what we're doing in Bouygues Construction in the UK. And I think it's important that all of us on this call, and whether supply chain, wherever we are, but as citizens of the planet, that we look to preserve the environment without sacrificing research, economic growth, employment, or the benefits offered by new technologies, whilst challenge the face of the climate challenge that we have in our communities and our local areas. But I think it's important through Bouygues Construction UK and our pillars of people, planet and client, that when it comes to the client, for example, it's important that we demonstrate that industry and companies like Bouygues Construction in the UK and all its entities and all you, our supply chain partners, come up with solutions and outcome driven, because that's what our clients want from us. They want solutions and outcomes to drive and assist with their climate agenda. So the solutions that combine technology and ecology to fight the effects of climate change. And I want to give reference to a Leonardo da Vinci quote from the 16th century. He said, "Take your lessons from nature, for that is where our future lies." And I think nature is the greatest engineer that we can learn from. Nature reinvents itself, it repurposes itself, it re-establishes itself through the challenging situations. And that's where we are today. We have the chance to reinvent, repurpose our business lines to a positive impact on the climate challenge, and also to meet our clients and customer needs through solutions and outcomes. So over the 2021, all our entities have been working collaboratively with me and our follow ExCo members to come up with our ambition and our climate action plan. And I'm just going to give you some headline information on them before Jerome Crispin will follow in through in the detail. So operationally net zero in our offices by 2025. Now, James has already explained what operational is and whether that's our sort of scopes 1 and 2. And again, we own them, we can have direct influence them, we can speed up and make that as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Then we want to be operationally net zero in all our new projects by 2030. And that's our sort of any project that we commence, and that's operational net zero. But the important one for you today and all our supply chain partners is net zero across our supply chain by 2040 with a 30% reduction by 2030. So that's across the scopes. And as partners of us, as David said in the introduction, you've been with us for many, many years and you're a tremendous asset and a support to us. And we're like one big family. So it's important for us through this collaboration, because no one person can do this alone, is that we, through our scale, help you on your scope 1s and 2s. So if, as part of this journey, we want to be true partners to you in helping you achieve your net zero ambitions on your scope 1 and 2 through our lessons learned, our best practice, and about the knowledge that we've gained on our journey to date. This has to be a two-way process. So working together, we will be stronger together. Next slide. So under the planet pillar, we have quite a large action plan under planet, people and client, and our full document will be available to you once we've finished the production of it and publish it. So I've taken out the ones that are appropriate for today's session. To be operationally net zero in all new constructed projects by 2030, where we have design responsibility from REBA stage 2 or before. So the target, and again, this is how we're aligned with James and the school, is whole life carbon assessments to be made on all projects commencing during 22, and then energy performance assessments also to be on all new contracts during 2022. So how are we going to do that? Across all our businesses, we are introducing different methods of measurement to get our baseline data correct and to do our projections correct. And we were using one predominant called one-click LCA, and that's helps us to inform design and the operational performance through the whole life cycle analysis. We'll do desktop assessments, and then with the goal of eliminating fossil fuel supply from all our construction sites. A big task, a big challenge, but one again that becomes through solutions and outcomes. We will meet our customer needs, clients' needs while addressing the climate challenge. Next slide. and more importantly to you as our people. We work together day in, day out on our projects across the UK. We have done for historical times, and we have a chance now to safeguard future generations for our families, our children, our grandchildren, and looking forward and doing what we can do now to preserve tomorrow. So we want to work in partnership with you to deliver awareness and learning modules through what we call ABC, so awareness, behaviour and culture. I think it's vital, and we recognise in Bouygues Construction UK that awareness has to be the priority at the beginning of any new journey that we go on, because through awareness we can have understanding and we can better knowledge of our impact and our solutions. So our target for 2022 and beyond is that 50% of our supply chain will have participated in the partnership with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, plus the Bouygues Construction in the UK learning and development modules, which we will share with you and collaborate with you. And then 100% participation and continuous engagement by 2025. This is not a task and finish in 1 year. Innovation, research and development, new methods of working will evolve on this challenge. So it has to be a continuous improvement process and continuous collaboration and continuously working together. Best practice, shared knowledge, innovation. So this is going to be an ongoing program that you'll be a part of, and one that we look forward to working with you. So we will, like I say, participate, communicate, evolve, engage, and work together. And through this then, we will learn from you, because you are also supply chain partners of other national contractors like ours. And I think it's going to be the collaboration across industry and all its sectors that's going to help our industry contribute positively to the climate challenge. And I think that will be me for now, because Jerome Crispin from Bouygues Energy and Services Contracting will take you through our action plan in a bit more detail. So I thank you for your time. Our contribution and attendance is amazing. It's been really good to see so many of you, and please get in touch if you need to talk to me about anything using the slide and the details that I've presented. Over to you, Jerome.
Thanks, Lee, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'll, as explained by Lee, I'll do a focus on the awareness and learning modules, what we call the learning pathways, and basically how we can try to help you, to help us basically as well, to achieve those ambitious carbon reduction objectives that has been set up by and presented by Lee. So some of you must know the Action Sustainability School, and what we are working with and trying to engage with you as supply chain partner. We want to onboard you, and what we want to do is we want to be able to communicate our vision and the commitments of the group in the UK around the carbon reduction and other sustainability objectives. And also what we want to be able is to raise your awareness as our partners and your skill around all the sustainability related subjects. So what we are aiming is we would like to have at least 50% of the key supply chain partner that we work with on a regular basis to be able to attend, and to do those learning pathway, which I will present in a bit more in the next slide. So Supply Chain Sustainability School, we've been working with this organization for quite a long time, and Supply Chain Sustainability School is a real partner, and they've been working in the industry for over a decade, and in how to basically educate the supply chain on sustainability matters. So this organization has a platform, and they've got existing content, and we will use those to reach you, or supply chain partner. Some of you will be members, but the one who are not members basically can access this content, and all the content is free, and there's tremendous and various content, and that is accessible, sorry, for free on this platform. Next, please. So the three themes that we would like to push forward to you is the first one, that is the purpose of the presentation, is the carbon reduction and the carbon reporting. So we've got few modules that will allow us to understand what is the carbon reduction and also how you can monitor and report. Because if you can't monitor and report that, you won't be able to assess and you won't be able to reduce your carbon emission. So this is a really important subject for us. The second one that is important is the single-use plastic and how to reduce that. In our industry, we have a lot of plastic, single-use. We really need to reduce that and try even to avoid the plastic as a single-use. The third one theme that we would like to push is the biodiversity, how to enhance it and how to preserve the biodiversity, because as some of the construction activity, we have a direct impact on those. So the learning pathway, that's how we'd like to, and we will be delivering those modules. So the school's learning pathway is basically a tool, and it's allowed to embed the awareness around sustainability with you. So what we do is we can allocate specific learning in a customizable way, and that fits all requirements. So the key features in a nutshell for this learning pathway. First, we've developed curriculum, and we've developed curriculum around the three themes that I've explained or presented just before. What we can do is we have a completion route, so we can then allocate mandatory resource, what is the minimum resource we'll expect you to do and complete. That will then, on completion, you will have what we call badges, basically, and you will have a series of badges that you will have once you've followed all those learning pathways. All those learning pathways and all the resources are at no cost to our supply chain. We are a partner of Action Sustainability School, and all the resources are free to our supply chain. What we can do, and thanks to this, it's a clever system. And what it does is basically, if you have already done a module, you won't have to complete it twice, because you will have a history of what has been done by you. So that allows us also to have a proper report. We can then see how our supply chain is engaging on those pathways and those curriculum. We will set completion date just to make sure you've got it within the time frame you can have that. And what these learning pathways allow us to do as well, as Lee has mentioned, is we can also share our own resource. We've got our own content, we've got our own resource by the group, and we can include that in those learning pathways. So the next step, we will communicate with you just to explain how you're going to access those learning pathways. All the members of the Supply Chain Sustainability School will be able to log directly and start to learn those pathways and the one that are available. For the people who are, or the organization supply chain partners who are not member, we will contact them and make sure they can register, explain them how to register for free, and how they can then have access to all the content of the learning pathways that we will be pushing. So that for us will be the start of a journey, as Ali explained. It's a journey together and how we can then reduce our carbon and ecological footprint. That's all for me. And sure, we have a Q&A session, and I will leave this to Louis and Amel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. We will go through a few other questions that we've been sent. So in terms of creating a baseline for your organization carbon emission, what's your recommendation on doing this, factoring in 2 years of COVID-19? COVID possibly will cause a lower baseline. Lee or James, if you can. Yeah.
James goes first.
Cool, happy to. Yeah, thank you. I would recommend going for a non-COVID year baseline for several reasons, because it's, and this is touch wood, that the pandemic is it's been terrible for many organizations and many people, but it's not going to be the way things are, and things will change going forward compared to where they were before the pandemic, but taking a baseline right in the middle of the pandemic is is a bit of a false positive, if I can use that phrase. So to give you an example, when Action Sustainability, our business, looked at our baseline to apply to science-based targets, we chose 2019, the calendar year 2019, and that's probably what I'd recommend as well. It all comes down to what data you actually have, though. If you've got good, robust baseline data, go with the best year that you have. But if you can do that before the pandemic came in, then go with that, or alternatively do 2022 or 21-22, depending on when your financial year sits.
Can I
go on, please.
And just to reiterate and support James there, what we have done as well, we've taken 2019 as the baseline, but acknowledge and being honest, we acknowledge that in there that data isn't as robust as we'd like it to be. There are some ratios, not actual. So what we are doing is, as I alluded to earlier, we're introducing proper measurement tools through the one-click LCA and the others. So we have been capturing 2021. So the likelihood is for Bouygues Construction in the UK, we will reset our baseline based at the end of 2022, because then that can give us an aggregation of reviewing the data from 2019 through, but then the robustness and the implementation of the measurement tools will kick in and be more accurate and give us more comfort by 2022. So we expect to see against our 2025 roadmap and route map of a spike upward through 2021-22, because obviously 19-20 through COVID there was a drop and then it'll go back. So a bit of a yin yang before we start to have a steady decline going through to our vision targets. But I think that openness and transparency is important from us to you as our supply chain partners, and likewise from our supply chain partners back to us. Again, it's a learning process. We're on a roadmap and a journey together, and I think we will learn together. But that's the approach we've taken as well, similar to what James has done.
Thank you, Lee and James. Another question has come in. Some of our competitors are purchasing offsets to achieve net zero. What are your opinions on this, and should we be wary in this area? So, James, I don't know if you want to take that one to start. Shall
I go first?
Yeah.
Because seeing as I'm currently live.
Yeah, sorry.
Just to think then, our approach through setting the action plan is that offsetting is a last resort, and we don't look to buy offsetting. We want to do it through innovation, collaboration, and using our knowledge and skills and our partners, and like the school and the Green Business Council and Construction Leadership Council. So for us, it's a last resort, not a first resort. We don't want to buy away, because putting stuff in Africa and the likes is not where we want to go. We want to harness the innovation and the drive and the energy to make it. But I think what we have to acknowledge, and James mentioned it earlier in his presentation, is that the current situation means that there's going to be an inevitable situation where there's an element of offsetting still needed. So I think it's important to acknowledge for them probably the next 3, 4, 5 years, whilst industry is evolving, becoming aware and more knowledgeable, and product manufacturers are becoming better in their EPD and their information, there's going to be an element of offsetting needed on your carbon offsetting. But I would predict, as time and knowledge and awareness and understanding increases, the level of offsetting will decrease.
James, anything else to add? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to back that. I totally agree with what Lee has said. For me, offsetting is a bit of it's a stepping stone. It is there as a mechanism to deal with those hard to decarbonise emissions. As we're working down through innovation and switching to lower carbon forms of fuel and materials, there's that hard to decarbonise bit. Where we need to get to with that hard to decarbonise bit is actually greenhouse gas removals. So that's literally taking it out of the atmosphere and locking it away. And there's lots of methods for doing this. Again, there's no one silver bullet, but some of those are quite nascent and they're not in a position yet where they are widely commercially available at an affordable price. Some of them that I've seen quoted for example, direct air capture of carbon, which is literally you suck it out with a fan and you bury it in rocks in simple terms. You're looking at $600 a ton. You can get offsets for $10 or $15 a ton. So there's clearly no price parity at the moment, but it will go that way. So offsets are a necessary part at the moment, but as Lee says, in the coming few years, we will reduce our emissions absolutely as we mitigate them and get more and more efficient. And then we'll be looking more to those greenhouse gas removal schemes that will help us with that last little bit that we just can't quite deal with yet.
Thank you. James, the next question, please. What practical advice would you give to businesses starting on their journey to net zero?
for me, it's understanding what your carbon impact is, doing that baseline I talked about, and understanding where and how much carbon you emit. Don't worry about super high level of accuracy. Just do something, get some calculations going, and like Lee was talking about with some of the stuff they've been doing, refine it over time. It's better to do something rather than nothing, and don't wait for the perfect answer to come in. Get going with something and have some calculations. Join the supply chain school, get resources through that, come on some of the workshops and training that I deliver and other colleagues deliver to give you the skills on how and where to do the carbon baselining, and then speak with your suppliers, speak with your clients about, well, what are the best things I can do economically as well. This is not about putting you out of business by any means. It's about what can you do effectively within your budgets to put different measures in place. You know, could be electric vehicles away from diesel. It could be different kinds of materials that can confer benefits as well. But unless, like I was saying earlier, unless you have that understanding of where you're at today, you don't know where you're going to in the future. It's a bit like trying to do a walk without a map. If you don't know where you're starting, you don't know where you're going to end up.
Can I come in with our partners at that point then? Just to switch me. Then is that, I think I touched on ABC, awareness, behavior and culture. And I think for any supply chain partner who's going on this journey is, don't be scared, firstly. Don't be fearful of these big words or this big terminology. You know, what we're trying to do is demystify some of the terminology that you've heard, and James has put many slides up that's tried to demystify the big acronyms and formulas and so forth, and he's presented in such a way that simplifies it. So don't be scared. I think first things first, I would look at your scope 1 and 2, because that is the thing that you can directly impact. So therefore, if you take it into the bits that you have a direct influence over, your awareness will increase. If you try to do the big ticket items start off without having an awareness of the bits you can control, your awareness will take longer. So have that low level fruit scope 1 and think, right, I will learn by getting my own business's direct emissions under control. Your awareness will increase, and then your knowledge will increase, and then you have the ability to get into behavior and culture. So I think is just approach it without fear, but also if you work in the public sector world, government are going to use this as a lever for change. So unfortunately, you're going to end up in a situation, and I'll be honest and transparent like we are trying to be. If you don't start soon, there's that analogy, if you stand still, you'll get overtaken. So it is going to be business critical for you. And like I said, we learn from nature, we need to reinvent and repurpose our business lines. Because if we stand still, we will get overtaken, and you will get overtaken. And that's being pretty honest with you. But I think it's, don't be scared, don't be fearful. The first step is always the hardest. But once you make that first step and you do the scope 1 stuff, and that's where we're looking to help you with, that awareness goes up and you go, right, okay, I understand it more now, I'm moving on to the next part. So collaboration with those that have already started the journey, sharing the lessons learned, sharing the knowledge, working with the supply chain school who are doing some tremendous learning modules in this. And I think you will do it, and you'll go, what are I worried about in 9 months' time when you look back?
Thank you, Lee. Another question has come in. I don't know if you want to take it first, Lee or James, but it's, how do I understand and measure embodied carbon for the materials and supplies that I purchase? I know James went into some detail about EPDs, but is there anything practical that they can do outside of that as well?
In terms of the level of detail that currently, like I said, this is it's something that's high profile at the moment, and every manufacturer and material supplier is getting themselves up to speed on. And I think James has touched on a few things of how it's trying to be worked and calculated. I think the analogy that I use is I started off in the industry as a quantity surveyor, and probably a failed one, people would say, but the likelihood is we used to have a bill of quantities back in the day, and I think if you were taking off or you're itemizing a section of work, you're going to end up thinking in the future of possibly a carbon bill of quantities. So every component of a building will have a value attached to it, and that then starts to visualize it and how it comes together. So I'm not sure if James can elaborate further, but I think EPDs are something, I think, where becomes like the old NBS specifications. And I think that's the industry standard that we're going to end up to, because that is of a language, whether you're a bricklayer, a drain layer, a plasterer, a painter, an electrician or everything, that is a language that everybody's become accustomed to. So I think something similar is the trajectory that we're heading on. And I think that makes it a language that's consistent, whether you're, like you say, an architect, an engineer, all the way down to a ground worker and left and right of that. And I think that's the industry and the sector's on a journey, and we're just starting it. So I think it's something that hasn't got all the answers yet, unless James wants to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I'll just build on that. Yeah, there's EPDs out there. I'll be totally honest that if you're an organisation making an EPD for your own product, it is quite expensive. So you want to do kind of a bulk buy. You want to make sure you get value for money. But if you're trying to find out the embodied carbon of the materials that you use, speak with your supplier, understand what it is that you're actually getting. So the bill of quants is a great place to start. What's the specification? There's various databases you can look up and get an understanding of what the embodied carbon is. Some of those slides I showed with, the plasterboard, the steel, the bricks and so on, that comes from a database called the Bath Inventory of Carbon and Energy. It's a downloadable spreadsheet. It's free to use, and you can look up lots of construction materials and some products as well, and it'll give you data on what those carbon impacts are. And it won't be specific to the product that you're buying, but it will be relevant and in the right ballpark for the material, because it's taken from other EPD data globally. So that's a good starting point. If your supplier has got an EPD, great, but it's like Lee says, it's a growing market for that place. But there's always information, and it's having a conversation. Have a conversation with your material supplier. They might have that information, but if they've never been asked for it, they won't give it, fundamentally.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Just to also mention that this presentation has been recorded, and we will be sharing the recording as well with you, as well as the presentation. The next question, I'll be answering that, but from Nigel: what is the best route to demonstrate innovation in plants, tools and equipment to Bouygues? Please do send your details and the innovation, and that goes to all of the different participants, to either Jérôme or myself, and we will ensure internally that we get the right person to get in touch with you from our procurement team. Lewis, do you want to take the next one?
Yep. So the next question, how prepared is industry to increase the prices of items made from recycled materials, as inevitably we as suppliers are facing these increases to offer more sustainable products? James, want to go ahead as you're on the screen?
I think there's always going to be that cost issue. We've seen it in many sectors before, where a new technology or a new material comes in and it's initially very high, but over time market dynamics bring those prices down. I think the whole sector needs to understand that if we're going to push forward on this, that there is going to be a requirement to move to these different products and materials, and that cost burden as it currently stands should be shared. It shouldn't just be flowed all the way down to the lowest common denominator at the bottom, and then pushing on so you do get those economies of scale. We saw it a decade ago with solar panels, for example. They are now a lot more affordable because there's been a growing demand for them. I see no reason why it shouldn't go in that direction for other materials as the demand for them drives. And this says to me that the big clients out there, the Highways Englands, the Network Rails, Environment Agency, the house builders and so on, who are stipulating this, need to understand as well, or everyone in that value chain needs to understand that at the moment there might be a bit of a price premium. But if we do our procurement right and we do our design right, to one of the comments that was in the chat earlier, we should be reducing our consumption overall anyway, and getting that kind of cost efficiency that comes out of it.
Thank you, James. The next one is from Stephen. What is the best approach for an SME who have limited resources in terms of measuring and gathering data?
This one is teed up to James.
Yep. If you're an SME, you're possibly in a better place. I work for an SME. It was relatively easy to grab the data. It was electricity bills, gas bills, fuel bills for your vehicles, or your mileage might be a better way of putting it rather than, litres of diesel. These are the key things. Go with the big ticket items to begin with, because that's going to be the majority of your carbon impact. It's the 80-20 rule writ large. There will be some things that you can't get data for, or they might be less significant. Don't sweat the details. Go for the big stuff first, and then over time, like Lee and I were saying earlier, you can then build in that other stuff as you get more confidence in delivering what you can. I understand with many SMEs that there is a time constraint. We in SMEs wear several hats. We don't just have one job description, but it's about the right people. It's finding the right people in your organization who've got a passion for this, who will find a way to grab that data. And very quickly you can get to a carbon footprint if you've got a few key pieces of information, like I say, on your buildings, your assets, your vehicles, some of the materials that you procure. That can be done relatively straightforward in my experience.
Lewis, can I come in?
Yep, go on, Lee.
You will have seen, obviously, that Jerome in his presentation on the pathway mentioned our partnership with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and it'd be remiss of me not to mention the tool that James put in his slides. That is a tool that we encourage. We've done some work and obviously lots of meetings with James and his team around that tool. And we think that is a great tool for SMEs, micro SMEs and businesses to start as a starting point on the journey. So I think it's a tool that is excellent. It helps you. It gets you into the way of carbon capture and calculation. And James is perhaps talking to us about how useful that tool is. And so I'll do it on his behalf and say we would recommend that part of this pathway process and collaboration is using the Supply Chain School carbon tool.
Thank you, Lee. Excellent. On that note as well, James, and I'll come into you next as well. So how often will the suppliers be required to submit their data into the carbon tool?
No, it's a good question. The minimum is annual. We've designed it deliberately to be an annual organizational level footprint. So that's about your whole organization. It's about an annual footprint. So whether it's a calendar year or a financial year, that you have that annual input. You are able in the tool to input more frequently if you so desire. And in some respects, it's actually good because then you get into the rhythm and the practice of gathering data and inputting it. It doesn't come to kind of end of year and there's this mad scrabble for all your data kind of as you work up to a deadline. But both options are there available. So you can do it annually, quarterly, monthly if you so desire. So it's really flexible in that sense. And then that's what gives the easy access to the data. You get your footprint out of it, your annual footprint as your organization, but you're also supporting Bouygues and your other clients in what is going to become their scope 3 footprint as well. So it's got more than one application to it.
And it's got a dashboard as well, hasn't it, James? So you can click on each issue and see exactly your impact.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like most tools these days. There's a dashboard, there's data entry. It's like any kind of system that you'd be used to online. And the beauty of it is that it is online. It's not a spreadsheet. There's no version control as such. There's no bits of paper flying around. As long as you've got a connection to Wi-Fi, you can get on and you have an account and you log in and you can plug in your data. And it comes back to the previous question about SMEs. You've got your data from your bill of quants or from your fuel invoice, and you'll get your numbers relatively quickly. Plug them in. The tool does all the maths for you. All you need to do is go in and make sure that the data is robust, and then you submit it for inclusion.
Thank you, James. And I think that kind of leads on to the next question nicely, and around numbers. So this is from Anonymous. We use the conversion factors available on DEFRA. Are the factors the same regardless of your source?
So I can pick that up to begin with. So the carbon calculator that the school has is based on and it's predicated on widely accepted data such as DEFRA Bays, which comes out every year in June. And those are all the emission factors I talked about. It was at 2.758 kilos of CO2e per litre of diesel. See, I do remember the number. All of those are in a big database that DEFRA and Bays publish on their website. It's free to download. And in terms of material impact, it's the Bath ICE database I mentioned earlier. So, if you use a kilo of sand or a ton of cement or whatever your material might be, those numbers are all there as well. So the idea is that we have comparability and consistency between different organizations.
Great. Thank you very much, James. I think that is it for the questions. Thank you very much to all of our speakers today. A lot of great and very interesting discussions. Hope you found it useful. As explained, we will be communicating with you and sending you the link for the recording, as well as the details for the carbon learning pathway, as well as the uploading of the information. If you've got any questions, or as I mentioned, if you have any innovations that you would like to also share with us, please do get in touch with our procurement team. Thank you very much, everyone.
So,
thanks, everyone.